If you're thinking about moving to Minnesota, you've probably already heard the usual stuff. It's cold. People are really nice. There are a ridiculous number of lakes. Okay, we get it. And yeah, all of that is true. But none of those things really tells you what it's actually like to live here. Because the stuff that can make you love Minnesota or make you want to pack your bags and leave usually isn't the stuff you see in the tourism commercials. It's the taxes, the cost of owning a house, how far you have to drive to see a doctor, what happens when you buy a house out in the country, and some really weird little rules you probably won't hear about until after you've already moved. So today, we're skipping the obvious Minnesota facts. We are talking about 10 things you should know before moving to Minnesota that could actually affect your decision. Number 10. Minnesota might give some of your money back. Let's start with something positive. Minnesota isn't exactly known as a low-tax state, but there are programs here that can actually put money back in your pocket if you qualify. For example, some homeowners can receive a homestead credit refund based on their income and property taxes. There's also a special refund for certain homeowners whose property taxes go up significantly. And renters aren't completely left out either. Eligible renters can claim Minnesota's renter's credit through their state income tax return. That's pretty useful. The problem is you have to actually know these programs exist. The state isn't going to show up at your front door and say, "Hey buddy, we owe you $1,300. You have to file the paperwork. Minnesota increased its homestead credit refund in 2026, and the state says hundreds of thousands of homeowners claim the refund each year. So when somebody tells you Minnesota has high taxes, that's not necessarily the end of the story. You need to look at what you're paying and what you might qualify to get back. Basically, Minnesota might take some money from your left pocket and put some of it back in your right pocket. You just have to remember to check the right pocket. Number 9. Your car can be surprisingly expensive to register. Here's something that can catch newcomers off guard. In some states, registering your car is basically a predictable little fee you pay once a year and forget about. Minnesota doesn't quite work that way. The state uses a registration tax based partly on the vehicle's value and age. So if you're driving a newer, expensive SUV, don't assume your registration bill is going to look anything like the person driving a 15-year-old Honda with one door that's a completely different color. And then you can have local wheelage taxes on top of that, depending on where you live. It's not necessarily enough to bankrupt you, it's just one of those recurring costs people forget when they're comparing states. Everybody looks at the mortgage, everybody looks at the income tax, nobody thinks about the boring stuff that keeps showing up every year. And Minnesota gives you another thing to think about: winter. Because your car is going to spend several months getting covered in salt, snow, ice, and whatever mysterious brown substance is on the road. So if you're moving here, figure out what your actual registration will cost. Don't wait until the renewal notice shows up and start wondering if the state thinks you bought a Lexus or a small yacht. Number 8. The sales tax situation gets complicated. Minnesota has a statewide general sales tax of 6.875%. Okay, but that's not necessarily what you're going to see at the register. There are local taxes, and the Twin Cities metro area has additional taxes for things like transportation and housing. Then individual cities can have their own local taxes. So where you live actually matters. You could be living in one suburb, drive 10 minutes down the road, buy the exact same thing, and pay a slightly different tax rate. That's just how local taxes work, but it can be easy to overlook when you're moving here from another state. And Minnesota isn't one of those states where you can simply say, well, the tax rate is this. It depends. That's why when you're figuring out your budget, use the actual city you're moving to. If you're buying a house, furnishing it, buying a car, replacing appliances, and doing all the other expensive stuff that comes with moving, those little percentages can start adding up pretty quickly, and suddenly that couch you bought doesn't feel nearly as comfortable. Number 7. Your property tax bill might not be the final word. Here's another interesting thing about Minnesota. Property taxes aren't exactly cheap, but qualifying homeowners can sometimes get a refund. The homestead credit refund is based on things like household income and property taxes. There's also a special refund for certain homeowners whose property taxes increase significantly. And if you're a renter, you may qualify for a renter's credit as well. That's great, but again, there is paperwork. And this is one of those things where you can live in Minnesota for years and never realize you were eligible for money because you didn't know about the program. It's kind of like going to a restaurant and the waiter doesn't bring you a fork. You sit there for 10 minutes eating soup with your hands, then somebody finally says, You know, you could have asked for a fork. Well, thanks. That's basically the tax system sometimes. So when you move here, don't just learn what Minnesota charges you, learn what Minnesota might give back. Because leaving money on the table because you didn't know about a tax credit is a pretty expensive way to learn about the state. Number 6. Your small town government might sell you a six-pack. Here's one of the stranger things about Minnesota. Some cities operate municipal liquor stores. Yep, the local government can actually be the business selling you beer, wine, and liquor. And in some places, the liquor store can even be connected to a bar. The idea isn't necessarily as weird as it sounds. The profits can go back into the community and help fund things like roads, parks, and other local services. So technically, that six-pack you just bought is helping pay for a snowplow. You're not drinking, you're investing in infrastructure. That's what we're going with. The funny thing is that rules can vary from one town to another. Hours can be different, what they sell can be different, and in a small town, there's a pretty good chance the person behind the counter knows your family. So if you're moving somewhere rural, figure out how things work locally. Where can you buy alcohol? When do they close? Are there restrictions? You don't want to discover at 8:59 on Saturday night that the local liquor store closed at 9 and the next one is 25 minutes away. If you don't drink, congratulations, you can completely ignore this entire section. Move on.
Number 5. That country house may come with its own water department. This one is especially important if you're moving outside the cities. You find this beautiful farmhouse, a few acres, maybe a barn, trees everywhere, nobody around. It looks fantastic. Then somebody asks, "Have you tested the well?" And suddenly you're learning more about groundwater than you ever expected. Private wells are common in rural Minnesota, and when you have one, you're responsible for maintaining it and making sure the water is safe. The Minnesota Department of Health recommends private well owners regularly test for things like bacteria and nitrate, along with contaminants such as arsenic, lead, and manganese. And arsenic is something you shouldn't ignore. The state says arsenic has been detected in a significant portion of Minnesota's private wells, with around 10% having levels above the federal drinking water standard. That doesn't mean you're going to move to Minnesota and immediately start drinking poison. It means you should test the water. That's it. If you're buying a rural property, test the well. Check the records, find out when it was last tested, look at the septic system, find out who maintains the road, because living in the country is great until you realize there isn't a city department coming out every time something goes wrong. Sometimes you're the department. Congratulations, you're now the water department. Number 4. That lakefront property isn't completely yours to do whatever you want with. This is one of those things that looks very simple in a real estate listing. House, lake, dock, boat, sunset. Perfect. Then you start looking into what you're actually allowed to do. Minnesota has shoreline regulations, and local governments can have their own requirements. You may have restrictions on construction near the water. There can be rules about docks. Vegetation removal can be regulated. Septic systems have requirements, and depending on the property, there can be flood plan or lake association rules you need to understand. So, buying lakefront property doesn't make you the king of the lake. You own your property, you don't own the water, and you definitely don't get to wake up one Saturday morning and decide you're building a giant dock because you thought it would look cool. Before you buy, find out exactly what you can and can't do, because nothing ruins the excitement of buying a lake house faster than discovering that the dock you've been planning isn't allowed. Now you're standing there looking at the lake like, well, this is awkward. Number 3. The Minnesota cabin isn't just a cabin. Minnesota has a serious cabin culture. People don't just have cabins. Some families practically have a second life up north. Friday afternoon comes around, and suddenly everybody is loading coolers, fishing gear, dogs, children, and enough food to survive a minor apocalypse into the SUV. Then they head north, and by Sunday night, they're all coming back smelling like campfire smoke.
It sounds great, and honestly, it probably is. But if you're thinking about buying a cabin, remember something. You're buying another property, another roof, another heating system, another tax bill, another place where something can break, and another building where mice can apparently form a government while you're gone. You might have a well, you might have a septic system, you might have a dock, you might have a boat, and all of those things cost money. That's why you need to think beyond the purchase price. A cabin isn't just, hey, let's go fishing this weekend. It's also, who forgot to drain the pipes? Why isn't the water working? Why is the refrigerator making that noise? And who is paying to fix the dock? Cabin life can be fantastic. Just don't confuse a vacation property with a free vacation.
Number 2, Minnesota has great healthcare, if you're close enough to use it. Minnesota has an excellent healthcare reputation. You have major medical systems, you have the Mayo Clinic, you have some very good hospitals and specialists. But here's where rural Minnesota gets complicated. Not every small town has access to the same level of healthcare. The Minnesota Department of Health has documented reductions in some rural hospital services, including maternity care, inpatient surgery, and mental health services. Between 2013 and 2023, 18 counties lost or reduced hospital birth services, and rural patients can have to travel much farther for certain specialized services. So, if you're retiring to Minnesota, don't just look at how pretty the property is, look at the healthcare map. Where's the closest emergency room? Where's the nearest cardiologist? What about cancer treatment? What about physical therapy? What happens if you need a specialist 6 months from now? Because a lake house 2 hours from a major medical center might be your dream property when you're 55 and perfectly healthy, at 75, you may have a very different opinion. Minnesota has excellent healthcare. Just don't assume that excellent healthcare means it's right down the road.
Number 1, Minnesota isn't cheap. It's a package deal. And this is probably the biggest thing you need to understand. Minnesota isn't the place to move if your only goal is finding the lowest possible tax bill. There are plenty of states where you can pay less in certain taxes and fees. Minnesota is doing something different. You pay into the system, and in return, you get a collection of benefits and public services. Worker protections, paid leave, tax credits, public parks, infrastructure, schools, healthcare systems, and the combination of big city opportunities with the ridiculous amount of outdoor space. That's the trade. You pay for the package, and whether you think that's a good deal depends entirely on what you actually want. If you're raising a family, Minnesota may make a lot of sense. If you care about worker protections, public services, and outdoor recreation, it may make a lot of sense. If you want a major metropolitan area but also want lakes and forests nearby, that's another advantage. But if you're moving here because you want the absolute lowest taxes in America, Minnesota probably isn't your first choice. And if you're buying some remote cabin because you want total isolation but still expect a specialist doctor, a contractor, a grocery store, and high-speed internet to be 5 minutes away, well, you might want to reconsider that particular cabin. So, should you move to Minnesota? Maybe, but don't make the decision based on a picture of a frozen lake or a guy telling you that everybody here is nice. Look at the entire package. Look at your income, your job, your family, your healthcare needs, your property goals, your tolerance for taxes, and most importantly, the specific place you're moving to. Because Minneapolis isn't northern Minnesota. A lake town isn't the Twin Cities. A rural farmhouse isn't a suburban neighborhood. And Minnesota isn't one giant lifestyle. It's a bunch of very different lifestyles packed into one state. If you choose the right one for you, Minnesota could be a fantastic place to live. If you choose the wrong one because the house looked great on Zillow, well, that's a different story. That's it for today. If you find this video helpful, don't forget to drop a like. And if you're thinking about moving to another state, check out the next video. See you in my next video. Bye.